I've been struggling with it's oddly this whole concept of soul because I've spent so many years with sort of the Buddhist perspective and Dzogchen. And what you were teaching today, it sounded an awful lot like what I remember Suryadas would talk about being there while getting there, like being in the view while working towards the view, sort of. Um, but and then the Dzogchen approach was kind of like transmission. He would, he was a lot of things he did was cliches, like my mission is transmission. I mean, he used to say that, but but yeah. So there's something that I find appealing about being in the presence of somebody who has a lot of the ability to do transmission, and I find that approach not just sort of slogging away, having like lousy meditations, hoping that they clarify someday. You know what I mean? There's something to be said for being around teachers that have that capacity to create a space of clarity around them that's catchy, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so this, I guess this is a two-part question because I do get that it's kind of dual and non-dual. Like the whole concept of non-dual is that it's both a path and no path. You're there and yet you're not. Sort of, you're working on it yet you've always been it. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And I think it's helpful to hold both of those views. And in my perspective, it's helpful. But the Buddhist tradition doesn't really talk. I mean, they don't talk about soul. They don't talk. You did say last time something about the mother of light and the mother and child light, or
luminosity.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've heard that, but I don't see. So primarily, the idea of a self is the self is the cause of suffering. That separation and division in the sense of a separate self is like the source of suffering, and that the idea. In fact, I remember asking at one point about the concept of a soul within Buddhism, and it doesn't exist. And that was the answer. And there is a tradition of stages of the path, but I'm having difficulty working with the concept of a soul because in my head it's really identified with a separate self, an identity, a separation. Yet my experience of it is more of just qualities of radiance. And I guess my question is, and the meditation you just did before the second half was really helpful because it helped me sort of tune into those qualities. But I'm still struggling, I guess, with my mental conception. And I'm wondering if you can help me with that.
Well, I think one of the things I keep going back to that I try to underscore a lot is that for me, non-dualism is truly transcendent in the sense that it can't be conceptualized. So the Buddha himself, for instance, said that one of the imponderables was either existing, being a self, or non-existing. So in one context, he coined the phrase no self, but in other contexts, he would say, the reality is neither affirmation of a self nor negation of a self. It transcends either statement. So in that sense, some people who try to resolve that within the Buddhist context, because that seems like a contradiction to, on the one hand, talk about no self, and then to, at the same time, talk about in another context that you can't affirm or negate the self. And the one resolution that's arisen that I think makes sense is we can think of relative truths that we can state, like no self, as like provisional tools rather than statements of ultimate fact. They're like antidotes to particular problems. So if a person's overemphasizing self, point out that there's a way in which self's an illusion, that we're really, like a common technique in Buddhism is to examine it and see that it kind of dissolves into a bunch of parts that are all karmically interwoven, and where's the self in there? And so from a certain point of view, that can have value if someone's clinging too much to a sense of self. The self is really kind of ego bound. It's a tool that can help free that up. I would suggest that there are people that have the opposite problem. Their sense of identity is too diffused and unintegrated, underdeveloped, and that consolidating and strengthening a sense of individuality, an ability to say no, to have boundaries, on a practical level. So yeah, on a kind of more mystical level, we start talking about more radical kinds of states. But functionally, even on a practical level, I would say just as much as maybe a concept like no self could be useful in certain contexts, the opposite could be useful too. I think it was Wilbur who made a funny reference at one point. He said a lot of women in our society, for instance, that he's met seem to have more of a problem with empowerment and identity rather than having a big ego. They need to get stronger in a sense of self. So he said maybe when doing Mundro and doing the 100,000 prostrations, instead of 100,000 kind of surrenders, they should do 100,000 standing up movements, right? So I think that really speaks to a point of view that I resonate with, which is anything that can be sort of talked about, conceptualized, or practiced is inevitably a partial view, that non-dualism is truly transcended in that sense, and that I prefer to kind of look at that truth then as we bring it to the relative level, and we kind of try to approach it in a balanced way. We need a lot of different perspectives. There's a great saying in Zen, again, enlightenment is the integration of 10,000 points of view. To me, no self would be one of those points of view. It's not an absolute truth. It's one of various views that are necessary to have a nice balanced toolbox of techniques and a nice balanced perspective. And then that helps to reveal something that actually transcends and yet embraces and contains all of that. So that's, as somebody with not only in this life a great love of Buddhism myself, and a history in other lives of deep involvement in that tradition, I sympathize with your issue there of trying to reconcile those. It is interesting to notice, though, and I wouldn't underemphasize this, that most Buddhist teachings that I've encountered too do kind of find a way inevitably to bring a sense of self back into it. It's implicit in the terminology and the concepts. Even explicit ideas like the child luminosity and the mother luminosity speaks to that kind of, recognizing that there's a state of even Norbu shows the term state of presence as a sort of English version of Rigpa. And presence is sort of a sense of, individualized realization. One strange thing to contemplate is, if there isn't individuality, at least at the relative level, how could one person be enlightened and another person not? Who realizes no self? If there's nobody to realize no self, then how can there be enlightenment in the first place? How can there be, you can be not enlightened now, enlightened later. Everybody has Buddha nature, so that's a given. You can't not be Buddha nature, but you can not realize Buddha nature. Or you can realize that that's what the whole path is about. Who is this that doesn't get Buddha nature? So for me, I just prefer a sort of what I would call a more tantric idea of self, that there is a samsaric version of self, and there's a nirvanic or enlightened or non-dual realization of self. And in the latter, self is transformed into a version that's not an obstruction to realizing one's interdependence with the whole.
So as you're speaking, it makes sense to me that enlightenment is more of a state of mind than a state of self or non-self. That's almost like a non-issue.
Yeah, this mystery of self. It's not that, you know, there's a great Theravada, some great Theravada teacher in the 20th century said to his students a lot, no self, no problem. I would just change that to no belief in separate self, no problem. Transform that belief in a separate self into a realization of the interdependent self, and that's nirvana. Yeah.